All right, and let's take a look here. So today we've looked at inferences before in language arts, and so by the time we finish here, we'll be able to make inferences based on facts or evidence, and make connections between people, places, and events in history. So it's going to be another one of those tools that not only are we working with inferences again, but along the way we're going to get a little bit of a history and civics lesson, continue to sort of build our knowledge on those things. So when it comes time to test taking, we'll have that background information. That's what we've encountered a few times where it's referenced stuff from previous classes and things that we've learned as far as the history side of it. So, and inferences is a good way to do that, help build that prior knowledge. Okay, and let's take a look at our audio.
An inference is a logical guess based on facts or evidence. When you make an inference, you put two or more pieces of information together, along with your own knowledge, to determine a possible meaning. In this way, making an inference is similar to putting together the pieces of a puzzle. Even before you have assembled the complete puzzle, you can begin to determine what it will look like. As you study historical information, making inferences will help you better understand the connections among people, places, and events that might not initially be obvious. As with other areas of the GED test, questions about making inferences will test your ability to interpret information at various depth of knowledge levels through the use of complex reading skills and thinking skills.
The one thing to kind of remember about inference, there's a little bit of a difference between inference and assumption, right? Assuming something is also often based on facts or information, but it might not always be enough information. So, if we were all at a party and we were going to order pizza, and you asked me, Matt, what do you want on your pizza? And I say something like, anything but mushrooms. You could assume, of course, that, or even infer maybe that I don't like mushrooms because I don't want them on my pizza. And you'd be correct in that case, right? Don't care for mushrooms. But, also said the same thing. And I said, well, anything but mushrooms or pineapple. Again, you could assume that I don't like mushrooms or pineapple. Well, in that case, I just don't like pineapple on my pizza. I like pineapple, just don't want it anywhere near my pizza. So with inference, you have to make sure that you have enough information so that it's not just an assumption. That's kind of the difference there. Assumptions can be correct, hunches can be correct, but in case of an inference, it's much more based on logic and the amount of information that you have. All right. All right, so here we go, talking about Woodrow Wilson. So after becoming president in 1913, Woodrow Wilson's first term was dominated by the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Throughout his first term, President Wilson aimed to keep the United States neutral. Tensions grew when German submarines attacked American ships. Britain also interfered with American ships in an attempt to blockade Germany. Despite these incidents, President Wilson worked to keep the United States out of the war. For his re-election campaign in 1916, President Wilson ran under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." President Wilson won the election and began his second term in 1917. And our first underlined section there in the text, it says, this sentence states President Wilson's intentions about U.S. involvement in World War I. This fact can be combined with another to make an inference. So we see there, right? President Wilson aimed to keep the United States neutral. And then the second underlined section says, for his re-election campaign in 1916, President Wilson ran under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson won the election and began a second term. And it says under that, this information can be combined with the other information to make a logical guess about the way the American public felt about the war. So, considering that He campaigned on the idea of keeping us out of the war. Through his first term, he worked to keep us neutral, that we wouldn't get involved. And then on his, part of his re-election campaign was keeping us out of the war. So if that is his campaign, you can assume that he is, trying to appeal to the voter. So in that case, you can infer that at that point, the Americans were not too keen about getting involved in World War I, right? That's the inference you can make there. It's that if he's dedicating that much of his campaign and he made an effort to keep us out, you could probably think the public opinion at that time was that we shouldn't be involved in that. That would have been the majority opinion. All right, so let's go on to our quiz. Yeah, Unit 3, Lesson 6 quiz. Here we go. All right, we have our same text there, and our tip here says, when making an inference, be sure your logical guess is supported by available facts. Even though an inference is a guess, it should have a strong chance of turning out to be true. So even with an inference, you might be missing some information, right? In the long run, it is possible that an inference could also be wrong, but it's a much stronger case than just jumping to a conclusion. You have enough information that, if it wound up being wrong, people aren't going to, jump on you and say you didn't have enough information when you made that inference, or, it just didn't happen. So question 1, Christiana, would you like to read question 1 for us?
Okay. Question 1. What can you infer about the American public feeling towards the involvement in World War I during President Wilson's first term? So A, most Americans believe that the United States should support Britain's blockade. B, many Americans supported President Wilson's policy of neutrality. C, Americans were angered by President Wilson's diplomatic approach to foreign policy. D, most Americans hope for the United States to avenge the loss of US ship. This C?
So B is a 4. Yeah, so like we were saying there, they most likely supported President Wilson's continued policy of neutrality towards the war, right? We had those two sort of ideas that he had kept us out of the war through his first term, and then campaigned on continuing to keep us out of the war. So B is a boy for number 1. Okay. All right. Some more reading here. I'm going to go ahead and read the first paragraph, and I'll hand it off here as we go. So 2 courageous women became early leaders in the women's suffrage movement at a time when women's rights was a startling idea to many Americans. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, lived 1815 to 1902, was already active in the anti-slavery movement when, in 1840, she was outraged by an anti-slavery convention's refusal to accept female delegates. As a result, she began campaigning for women's rights and was a key organizer of the first Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, after she met Susan B. Anthony, 1820-1906. The 2 women formed the National Women's Suffrage Association and worked to gain the right to vote through amendments to state and national constitutions. So we've talked a little bit about Susan B. Anthony before. Etta, you want to take the second paragraph?
Okay, it says, in her effort to challenge the lack of suffrage for women, Susan B. Anthony voted in the 1872 presidential election. She was arrested and put on trial. The judge ordered the jury to find her guilty and imposed a $100 fine. When she refused to pay, the judge did not sentence Miss Anthony to prison, which effectively ended her chance of an appeal. A prison sentence would have allowed the suffrage movement to appeal the decision and take the question of women's voting rights to the U.S. Supreme Court. You want me to read it the rest?
Yeah, go ahead, finish that off.
By 1900, women could vote in only 4 states, but the campaign for a national constitutional amendment continued. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, women throughout the United States finally gained the right to vote.
Grace, you want to read the question for us?
Sure. Which of the following inferences can you make about Elizabeth Cady Stanton? A, she opposed the anti-slavery movement. B, she made speech on women's suffrage. C, she worked for prison reform. And D, she had difficulty working with others. Is it B?
Yeah, B as in boy, right? Yeah, you can infer because of her work in the women's suffrage movement that she likely made speeches. And then we can eliminate the other ones. She obviously didn't oppose the anti-slavery movement, right? She was anti-slavery, so she was, part of that movement. We don't have anything here about prison reform, and we don't have enough here to say whether or not she was difficult to work with. She obviously she worked with Susan B. Anthony, so there's some indication that she probably actually was kind of amiable and worked with other people. So that leaves B as in boy for number 2. Okay, and number 3, got the same passage. Sasha Gay, would you like to read number 3 for us?
What can you infer about women's suffrage in the United States before 1920? A, women were prohibited from voting in any election throughout the United States. B, only white women had the right to vote throughout the United States. C, women in some states could vote for governor, but women in other states could not. And D, women who were part of the women's suffrage movement could vote because of their political activism. A? Is it A?
It's C. Yeah, C as in cat. So women in some states earlier on could vote, and they could vote in like state elections, but it wasn't across the board. A while back, we had like a chart or a table that showed some of the states that had women's suffrage, right? I think Utah was one of the first ones, and there were several others that had adopted it before it became national and federal. So C is in cat. There were some women, in some states that could vote where others could not. So A, there was a few, so that's incorrect. Only white women could vote. No women could vote. Doesn't matter. Race had nothing to do with it. It was pretty much women regardless. And then D, women were part of the suffrage movement. That's inaccurate too. It didn't matter whether you were politically active or not. It depended on the state if you could vote or not. So, and then we have a little graphic here talking about leaders of the women's suffrage movement. So on our left-hand column, we have the leader, the individual, and the dates they lived, and their accomplishments on the right. So first off, we have Lucretia Mott, who was lived from 1793 to 1880. She was active in both the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. So with, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And in 1866, she became the first president of the American Equal Rights Association, which worked for equality for women and African Americans. And we'll see this kind of confluence. Those two elements often came together. So the women's suffrage movement, women's right to vote, women's rights in general also coincided and dovetailed with like the anti-slavery movement and larger civil rights issues. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 1815 to 1902. She was a founder of the women's rights movement in the United States. She helped plan the first Seneca Falls Convention, which we see with Lucretia Mott, and with Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States in 1876. Lucy Stone, 1818 to 1893, was an early activist in both the women's rights and anti-slavery movements. Her speech at the National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse, New York in 1852 influenced Susan B. Anthony later in her career. Lucy Stone worked with Frederick Douglass to support passage of the 15th Amendment, right? So now we're talking again about more of the civil rights acts or amendments. And of course, Susan B. Anthony, which is probably one of the most famous women's rights, women's suffrage leaders. We hear her name probably more than the others. From 1820 to 1906, she became part of the anti-slavery movement and then was introduced to the women's rights movement by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. With Stanton, Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. So there's four of our really significant women in the suffrage movement. Okay, Christiana, you want to read question 4?
What information can you infer from the table? Many leaders who fought for the women's rights also supported rights for African Americans. B, men and women did not work together to expand rights within the United States. C, Elizabeth
Katie.
Cade, and the S word is what?
Stanton.
Okay, Elizabeth Cade Stanton and Lucky Stone never actually met. D, all supporters of women's refugees suffrage. Okay, women's suffrage were in the North after the Civil War. A?
Yeah, like we mentioned, so a lot of those were introduced to the women's suffrage movement, through the anti-slavery movement, through civil rights, supporting civil rights for African Americans and things like that. And that's what I was saying, those things kind of came together because there were similar issues too, right? That the suffrage was part of civil rights for African Americans too, the right to vote. So they found a lot of support for each other in those movements. All right, so number 4 is A. And 5, our last one here, Etta, could you read number 5 for us, please?
Okay. What inference can you make about the voting record of these women suffrage leaders? A, all of the women were arrested for attempting to vote at some time in their lives. B, although they could not vote nationally, all of the women could vote in their own states. C, the women only supported the right of white women to vote nationally. Or D, none of the women ever voted in a presidential election. B?
Actually, it's D. Yeah, D is in dog. So the one thing here, right, if you look at when they passed away, only 2 of them made it until the early 1900s, right? Stanton, 1902, Susan B. Anthony, 1906. But the amendment wasn't passed until 1920. So sadly, all these women that worked, really, and made it their life's work, didn't get the right to vote. Their work secured it for women later, but they themselves weren't able to take advantage of it because the amendment didn't pass until later. So yeah, D there, none of the women ever actually voted in a presidential election. So, all right, that's our quiz. So 1 was B as in boy. 2 was B as in boy. 3 is C as in cat. 4 was A. And 5 was D as in dog. And it's true, some of these women were arrested, but what we have in our graph doesn't explain that, right? We don't see that information. And for the second one, although they could not vote nationally, all the women could vote in their own states. Only some of them could, right? We talked about that. It just depended on what state they lived in. And then they did support universal suffrage. So not just white women, but all American citizens. So that leaves D there. All right. All right. So 5 is D. Let's move over to our workbook. And we're stating here again that an inference is a logical assumption made by considering 2 or more pieces of information. The more information you have, the more accurate your inference can be. As you continue reading a text, new information may confirm or contradict your inference. And it may be necessary to revise the inference, which we mentioned before. Sometimes it might be incorrect. When making inferences, you use the information you have to develop new ideas about a particular subject. When reading historical information, making inferences enables you to connect people, events, and ideas in ways that may not be explicitly stated in the text. And that's also where it comes into play, where the more we learn about history and these historical events and these people, you're building that knowledge so that you can also make inferences when you do receive new information that expands on what you already know. And then finally, it says, as you read, think about how the information fits together. An inference works like a puzzle or an addition problem. If you know fact X and fact Y, you can put them together to make a new piece of information. And that's what we do as historians. We ask questions and we look for as much information as we can to support new ideas about the past. All right. So again, we're talking about World War I and President Wilson. So World War I was being waged in Europe during President Woodrow Wilson's second term. In 1916, Germany announced that its submarines would no longer refrain from attacking U.S. ships, even though the United States was officially neutral. On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress to address the rising conflict with Germany. And this is from Woodrow Wilson's message to Congress. It is a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of Congress, which I have performed in thus addressing you. There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts. In our top bracket there, it says this paragraph provides information about the start of President Wilson's second term as president, and we pay close attention to the facts and keep them in mind as you read his speech. So the war in Europe is, it's drug on. We have millions of deaths at this point, and Germany is becoming more hostile towards the United States because it's going to go after our ships with submarine warfare. And then the second box there, it says identify details in the speech that you can put together with the information in the paragraph above. as well as your previous knowledge, use the information to make an inference about President Wilson and his message. So things are dire in Europe. Germany is not a threat to us as far as we're not going to get invaded by Germany, but it's threatening our shipping. It's costing American lives. And you look at the second piece of information, and we're seeing a turn in Wilson's thinking on the war, right? It's all in there. Distressing and oppressive duty, which I have performed in thus addressing you. So we can see a change of heart for Wilson that we're going to have to get involved. We're not going to have a choice here if we want to help determine the peace. For one, we're going to have to be involved. If we want to protect American shipping, if we want to protect our way of life, we're going to have to get involved in this. So that's what he's, addressing here, after what we'd already said that he had campaigned on trying to keep us out of the war, but things change, right? And it's not going to be possible at this point. And our tip here, you sometimes will make inferences based on information presented in a passage or a visual. At other times, you must combine new information with your existing knowledge to make an educated guess. And that's, what I was talking about before. We've talked about World War I, we've talked about women's suffrage and things like that. So hopefully you've collected some information, and when you get new information along the way here, we can put that all together to, make inferences and discuss history and help complete our knowledge there. All right. Grace, would you like to read our first question? Grace might not be there.
Oh, I was
okay. Okay.
I was
Go ahead.
Which of the following situation led President Wilson to address Congress? A, the states of the war in Europe. B, the beginning of President Wilson's second term as president. C, the increasing military power of Germany. And D, the announcement that Germany would attack US ships. D?
Yeah, specifically, it's the attack of US ships by Germany. All right. So yeah, D there for number 1. And our same passage again. Sasha Gay, would you like to read number 2 for us?
What can you infer about President Wilson's view about the United States entering World War I? A, he believes it soon would be necessary. B, he has become more determined to remain neutral. C, he believes the United States could win the war quickly. D, he believes the war is being fought for economic reasons. B.
So A, at this point, initially, he was wanting to remain neutral. This is not what he wanted to do, but by the time that he makes his speech, April 2nd, 1917 is when he goes before Congress. So he's at this point realized that there's not really any other choice. We're going to have to get involved. So A for number 2. And this, of course, is really late in the war. Like I said, this has been going on for years, and there's millions of deaths have already occurred. We were very late in entering World War I. All right, so number 2 is A. And number 3. All right. So I'll read the top here and I'll pass this off. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted in the presidential election and was arrested and fined. She refused to pay her fine and used her arrest to highlight her beliefs about women's rights, especially the right to vote. The campaign to gain national voting rights for women in the United States continued well into the 20th century and did not meet success until after the end of World War I. Christiana, you want to read her message, her speech here?
Okay. From friends and fellow citizens. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under
Indictment. It's one of those words that's, yeah, it doesn't necessarily sound. Yeah.
Indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the least presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in this voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' right guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national constitution beyond the power of any state to deny.
Go ahead and finish off. Yeah, read the next.
It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizen, but we, the whole people who found the union. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denying the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballots.
All right. Yeah, so she's really making a case here. Are we not equal citizens? If that's the case, then we need equal right. We need the right to vote. We need to share every right that every white male citizen has. And later, it's also going, when it comes to the civil rights movement, after World War I and especially after World War II, when you have African-American men and women serving in the military, that really helped drive the civil rights movement, because they're like, look, we served our country. We are every bit deserving as anybody else, as far as our rights are concerned. That is, serving in the military is one way that you express your citizenship. And we talk a lot about, thank you for your service, and things like that. And so, a lot of African-American men were coming back, and they were angry because they came right back to the same situation, especially when they didn't experience the same thing in Europe. They didn't necessarily get treated the same way. There wasn't the type of segregation that they experienced here. And that's what kind of Susan B. Anthony is also speaking to here as well. Are we not citizens? Do we not share the same rights? All right, so number 3. Etta, you want to read question 3 for us?
Okay, to what text is Miss Anthony referring in the second paragraph of her speech? The A?
Yeah, it's the preamble to the Constitution. She mentions the Constitution in the first paragraph, so that kind of tips you off, right? But then when she's talking about we the people, that language is in the preamble. So yeah, A for number 3. All right. Number 4, Grace, would you like to read number 4 for us?
All right. Which of the following can you infer based on the information? A. Susan B. Anthony is mocking the Constitution. B. Susan Susan B. Anthony believes that the Constitution already guarantees women the right to vote. C. Susan B. Anthony believes that women enjoy liberty. And D. Susan B. Anthony is opposed to amending the Constitution for any reason. B.
Yeah, right. It applies to everybody equally, right? So B as in boy for number 4. That's what she's getting at there. This already, it's already evident. This shouldn't be an issue. It's in the Constitution. So yeah, that's the point she's making there. B as in boy. So let's see here. Spain. Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States following the Spanish-American War, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. It was placed under military rule until 1900, when the United States established an administrative government there. The 1970 Jones Act officially made Puerto Rico a territory of the United States, which of course it is still today, granting Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship. The Jones Act separated the 3 branches of Puerto Rican government, provided civil rights to individuals, and created a locally elected bicameral legislature. However, Puerto Rico's governor and the U.S. president had the power to veto any law that the legislature passed. Also, the U.S. Congress had the power to stop any action taken by the legislature in Puerto Rico. The United States maintained control over fiscal and economic matters and exercised authority over mail services, immigration, defense, and other basic governmental matters. And it's much still the same today. You might hear in the news sometimes that there's efforts to grant, Puerto Rico stateship, right, to make it the 51st state. There's a good case for that. They have like it's sort of like they don't get a vote in Congress, but they have like a representative there. So of course they are considered U.S. citizens, but Puerto Rico is not a state, and the federal government can intervene more so in Puerto Rican politics than it can with U.S. states. There's a different type of control there. So the federal government will sort of supersede anything that can supersede the Puerto Rican government still as a territory, which is, of course, why they want stateship. Sasha Gay, could you read the 18th Amendment piece here?
From the 18th Amendment, Section 1. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Section 2. The Congress and the several states shall have a concurrent power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
So this is referencing prohibition, right? When they basically, federal government banned the sale and production of alcohol for consumption. That's what it's saying, for beverage purposes. We'll see in our question here, well, what does that have to do with Puerto Rico? Christiane, you want to read question 5 for us?
Okay, question 5. Which of the following can be inferred about what's the name?
Puerto Rico. Yeah.
Okay, Puerto Rico. Okay. Puerto Rico objected to Spanish rule. B. Puerto Rico were subject to the same rules as U.S. citizens under the 18th Amendment. C. Puerto Rico was allowed to continue some production of alcoholic beverages. D. Puerto Rico had to ratify the 18th Amendment before it could become law. Is it B?
Yeah, B, right? So Puerto Ricans were subject to the same rules as U.S. citizens under the 18th Amendment. So this was going to apply to Puerto Rico the same as all the other amendments. However, they are not, they were considered a territory and not a state. So you can infer, right, in this first piece, because the United States maintained control over fiscal and economic matters and exercised authority over, mail, immigration, defense, and other basic governmental matters, that Puerto Ricans were going to be subject to the same rules. B is in boy, number 5. All right, Etta, you want to read number 6 for us?
Okay, the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919. In which year can you infer the amendment's measures took effect? Would it be B?
It's C. So it passed in it was ratified in 1919, and then where it says here in section 1, after 1 year from the ratification. So it took a year basically to take effect there. So by 1920, those measures took effect. So C as in cat, number 6. All right. Oh, and okay, so we have, a little more about prohibition here. So prohibition refers to a period during which the making, transporting, and selling of alcoholic beverages were prohibited or illegal. In the United States, a movement to outlaw alcohol began in the mid-1800s and quickly rose to national attention. Afterward, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution instituted prohibition as national law. However, this law proved very difficult to enforce. Many Americans participated in the illegal production of alcohol known as bootlegging. Underground drinking establishments and organized criminal activity flourished. By 1933, the 21st Amendment had repealed prohibition. As of 1966, no state prohibition laws remained in effect. It's one of those times that the government did something that was extremely unpopular with a large part of the population, so much so that, really alcohol production never stopped. You had these underground establishments, you had speakeasies, which were, basically bars that were, secret bars that people would go to. So it did not work at all. We can see today that, there's, you would never know that there was such a thing if you just kind of showed up in 2022 and looked around at, say, any sporting event or, your grocery store, that we tried to outlaw all consumption of alcohol at one point in this country. So number 7, Grace, you want to read number 7?
Okay. What can be inferred based on the repeal of prohibition by the 21st Amendment? A, Congress no longer supported prohibition by 1933. B, the Great Depression led people to reduce alcohol consumption. C, bootlegging proved to be unprofitable. And D, prohibition was more difficult to enforce at the local level. D?
A, Congress no longer supported it. Yeah, it was, it did become more difficult. It was just generally, because these, it was just hard to police. It was hard to crack. I mean, you think about illicit drugs today, and the trouble of enforcing that. It was the same thing, with alcohol at that time. It was still rampant. So it wasn't just at the local level, it was the federal level. as a result, that organized crime was involved, so guys like Al Capone, these mobsters that we hear about, that have been kind of glorified romance. A lot of organized crime came about because of prohibition, moving alcohol and having these speakeasies and things like that. So 7 is A. Number 8, again, prohibition. Sasuke, you want to read number 8 for us?
What can you infer from the passage above about state prohibition laws? A, these laws were superseded by the 21st Amendment. B, state laws sought to control underground drinking establishments. C, the laws proved easier to enforce than national prohibition measures. D, some state legislatures believed that consumption of alcohol was dangerous and immoral. Is it D?
Yeah, it's D. D as in dog, right? So 8, they were convinced, and I mean, they're not necessarily wrong, at least part of the dangerous part. But there was also a movement, it's called the Temperance Movement, that was really pushing for the banning of alcohol. And at that time, you had Congress was susceptible to it. They were more than happy to take a look at that and wound up ratifying the Constitution. We know how hard we've talked about ratifying an amendment and what that takes, and they actually were able to do that with prohibition in the 18th Amendment. And then number 9, we got our same prohibition passage here. Christiana, you want to read number 9?
Okay, number 9. What can you infer about? What can you infer by the fact that many Americans took part in illegal production and consumption of alcohol? A, most Americans are not law-abiding people. Americans believed prohibition restricted their individual rights as citizens. C, the police did not try to enforce the law. D, the jobs of most Americans depend on the production of alcohol. D.
So B. Yeah, B as in boy. They just felt that this, was basically a violation of their rights, of their individual rights. So, all right. So B as in boy for number 9. Okay, and so milestones in the 1920s. The 1920s were an interesting time. There was, like what we have here in our column on the left, world's first, arts and culture, society, labor law. A lot went down in the 1920s. So we'll take a look here of what events occurred. So in 1920, assembly line production of Model Ts helps usher in the age of automobiles. So Henry Ford sort of perfected the assembly line to make production faster and cheaper for automobiles. It made the price of automobiles come down, made them more affordable. So you saw the auto industry take off in 1920. First commercial radio broadcast by a station, KDKA. There's some debate as to whether or not they really were the first, but KDKA is a station out of Pittsburgh. So at least here, one way or another, whether it was KDKA or another station, you had the first commercial radio broadcast. So now you're reaching huge audiences across vast distance instantaneously, in real time, right? No longer as far as like, news, music, you can very quickly and broadly start to change our culture, with music and news. It's just a huge technological breakthrough. Also in 1920, first three-color traffic light invented by police officer William Potts. So after we have more cars on the road, realized that this was going to be an issue, so we started seeing our first traffic lights. 1927, first transatlantic airplane flight made by Charles Lindbergh. So he flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in Paris, I believe. So another huge event. Right now, we always talked about how the Atlantic and the Pacific were these huge barriers for the United States, that it helped us grow without a lot of interference. Once we, dealt with Britain, we had this time to slowly grow, didn't have to worry about invasions and everything. And a lot of that had to do with the size of the seas, the size of the oceans. We, started shrinking the world now through flight. Now what would take maybe a several weeks voyage, well, not by that time, not with like steam power or coal power, but certainly days of travel. We're starting to shorten that through flight. World's becoming smaller. Also 1927, first talking movie, The Jazz Singer, was released. So another cultural event there. And then in our arts and culture section, we have Louis Armstrong joins King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. Edith Wharton wins Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Age of Innocence. Society, women cut their hair and shed their corsets to embrace flapper fashion. So that was a little bit of liberation for women. You've seen the style, right? The sort of short dresses with spaghetti straps, and they have the bob haircuts. Really different style than what came before. The corsets and the hoop skirts and all that stuff. It was much more streamlined, but it was also a way that women were expressing themselves through fashion. And in 29, Chicago organized crime members killed in St. Valentine's Day massacre. So that also kind of coincided with the Prohibition movement. Labor and law. So 1920, League of Nations is dissolved, although the United States never became a member. We talked about the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, and trying to prevent further, global conflict like World War I. But it didn't. It only survived for a short time. It was already gone by 1920. In 1923, U.S. still institutes an 8-hour workday. So labor movements also really, really big in the early 20th century, and they fought, for things like an 8-hour workday, a 40-hour work week, benefits, holiday time or vacation time, things like that. So U.S. Steel being one of the companies to, implement those types of ideas for their workers. And Ford Motor Company increases minimum wage 1929 from $6 to $7 per day, which is, really not much. When you think about today, when we talk about per hour rather than per day, but a dollar increase from $6 to $7 is huge at that time. So that's something to consider. Okay, so there's our table there and some of the important events from the 1920s. So Etta, could you read number 10 for us?
Okay, it says, oh shoot, my thing went down too far. Hold on. Based on the milestones reported in the table, which of the following can be inferred about the 1920s? A, life in the 1920s was dangerous. B, life for working people was more difficult in the 1920s than in the decades prior. C, artists and musicians gained international fame in the 1920s. Or D, the 1920s was a time of exciting innovation. D, maybe?
Yeah, it was a lot of innovation. It was an exciting time. Yeah, so D is in dog for the 1920s, roaring 20s, as they're called, but really important time. Right, and 11, Grace, could you read number 11 for us?
Of the following experiences, which can be inferred to have empowered women in the 1920s? Working in factories during World War II. B, going to plays and movies. C, gaining the right to vote. And D, being able to drive cars. Is it C?
Yeah, C is in cat, gaining the right to vote. Going right to it there. Good. Yeah, so, and I want to point out here, right, this is one where prior knowledge is going to come into play. World War II doesn't happen until the 1940s, right? So we're talking about the 20s here, in between World War I and World War II. So that's one way with your test taking skills, to eliminate some of that stuff. We might, hopefully we'll talk about like the women in the workforce in World War II. That's pretty cool stuff. Going to plays and movies, it doesn't say that, in our text, but we can infer, that women, as it says here, this women cut their hair and shed their corsets to embrace flapper fashion. This sort of, liberating movement for women is right on the heels of, and so that's what that's about. C as in cat. All right. So I'm going to read through this. We're going to have a little text, well, a little writing exercise here at the end. So what this is going to be about is using inferences you have made based on the table and the passage. Describe the ways in which Presidents Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt viewed the responsibility and powers of the federal government. Support your inferences by incorporating relevant and specific examples from the table and the passage, as well as your own knowledge of the enduring issue and the circumstances surrounding the two administrations. So I thought it would be important. I want you to, take a look at the prompt, the writing prompt, to see what we're going to be looking at here. So we're going to be making inferences, incorporating relevant and specific examples from the table and the passage and our own knowledge of the issues and circumstances surrounding the two administrations. So sort of comparing and contrasting the two administrations. All right. So just pay attention. I'm going to read through it here and see what you pick up on. Think about some of the differences or similarities between Hoover's presidency and Roosevelt's. And we're dealing with the Great Depression here. So after the stock market crash of 1929, the United States sank into a deep economic crisis called the Great Depression. Banks all over the country failed, taking the savings of millions of Americans with them. Jobs became increasingly hard to find. Within a few years, about 1/4 of American workers were unemployed. Increasing numbers of people were hungry, homeless, and had little hope. President Hoover attempted several measures to bring the nation out of its economic crisis, but the situation worsened. With the presidential election of 1932, Americans wanted a change of direction, and with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, they got a new deal, in contrast to the policies of President Hoover. So the Great Depression, it's often, we talk about it with the stock market crash of 1929. The stock market crash was more of a symptom of the Depression than actually causing the Depression. But all in all, this was a global crisis, which we've talked about. Germany was probably worse off than the United States when it came to the economic impact of the crisis of the Great Depression. But it had a huge impact. It had a huge impact on the U.S. We've had a lot of economic issues here in the last couple of years in the United States, but it really was nothing like what people experienced at that time, just generally speaking. It's certainly, every day there's people are struggling or have economic issues, but just the amount. And we see here 1/4 of American workers were unemployed. So it was a huge problem. And entering into the Depression was Hoover as president. And basically, after he failed to, correct the problem, so to speak, Americans were looking for something new. They were looking for a new president. They were looking for change, which often happens. People get frustrated and want something new. So our table here, talking about the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, our left side there's Hoover's administration, and some of the activities under his administration that took place. So Agriculture Marketing Act under Hoover was a government purchase of farm surplus to boost farm prices. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, high tariff set to protect American farm goods from overseas, right? A tax on overseas goods. Reconstruction Finance Corporation was government loans to banks and corporations in danger of closing. Voluntary deals between government and businesses to keep businesses open and workers employed. Red Cross asked to distribute government surplus food to those in need. And the federal government makes loans to states to help with state and local relief programs. So that occurred under the Hoover administration during the Great Depression. And on the right, we have what occurred in the Roosevelt administration, just some of it, actually. So Emergency Banking Act, stabilized banking system and reopened banks. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act, government ensures bank deposits to reestablish confidence in banking. The Civil Works Administration provides government funds to employ people to build roads, bridges, and schools. So this was like a public work act to try to get people back to work. Along with the Civilian Conservation Corps, puts young men to work planting trees, doing soil conservation projects, working on facilities in national parks. There was a park that I grew up close to, the Grandview State Park, that was built under a Civilian Conservation Corps at this time. They have a huge amphitheater there that puts on plays and everything. And a lot of the state national parks that we have today were built or improved out of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Works Projects Administration. So it employs the jobless on public works projects such as roads, airports, parks, includes employing thousands of artists who paint murals on public buildings, authors who write travel guides, actors and musicians who give free performances. The Farm Credit Bureau, which is still around today. Government provide loans to heavily indebted farmers to prevent farm foreclosures. Rural Electrification Administration loans funds to local utilities to bring electricity to most of rural America. The Agricultural Adjustment Act provides funds to farmers to stop growing surplus crops with the goal of raising crop prices. And then the Tennessee Valley Authority provides jobs for building a system of dams to provide electricity and flood control to rural areas in 6 states. So just taking a look at what we have here, what can you infer about the two administrations? What's the differences here? Generally speaking, just what do you notice, just off the top of your head? Put to you this way, which ones seem to do more? Anyone take a guess? So the legacy of Roosevelt, right, is that we have all of these lasting programs, new administrations, federal improvements, things like that. So, and it's, historians will debate this. Did he go too far? Was this federal overreach? Conservatives today, particularly really hardcore conservatives will say this was the beginning of federal overreach and federal and overspending in our government because of Roosevelt's programs and acts to try to bring us out of the Great Depression. Hoover was conservative, looked to what we call laissez-faire economics, right? It was kind of a hands-off approach. Do as little as you had to do to try to boost the economy and get us out of the Great Depression. And a lot of his, a lot of the activities around his administration was engineered and geared towards corporations, not so much individuals. We have, because of Roosevelt, more federal spending, more federal intervention. And you can look at that one way or the other. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We'll debate that probably for the rest of time. But he was certainly more involved, and his administration, the federal government, was much more active in trying to get people out, bring us out of the Great Depression. So there was a lot more spending, a lot more federal spending. We did go in debt trying to get people back to work, but we did have programs that did put people back to work. And then thanks to because of World War II, that finally kind of brought us out of the Great Depression because of the preparation for war and the spending and, helping out Europe with the fight, helped get us back on our feet and made us again a creditor instead of a debtor. Okay, so we got to put together some writing here. So thinking about the differences, enduring issue and the circumstances surrounding two administrations. So President Hoover was much more limited in his use of the federal government. To end the Great Depression. Okay. So President Hoover, well, to say Hoover used a top-down approach. And that means, working like, so the women's suffrage movement was a bottom-up approach, right? It started on the ground. It started with women. It started with individuals working together to change the situation, change the women's suffrage movement and include them in voting. A top-down approach would be when the federal government does something to help, and it could be right at the top. So in this case, as far as him going to banks and corporations, right? So it's very top-down. He's not addressing the individual as much as he is the corporations, the organizations, the banks up here. So it's a top-down approach. So Hoover used a top-down approach. To resolve economic issues. And then Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, took a much more active role with more programs directed at American citizens. Roosevelt made the federal government, or say Roosevelt gave, Roosevelt gave federal government a more active role. Well, here we go. Do this. Federal government. Played a larger part in resolving the economic issues of the Great Depression under Roosevelt. There we go. So President Hoover was much more limited in his use. Of course, this doesn't get scored like our multiple choice and stuff. So President Hoover was much more limited in his use of the federal government to end the Great Depression. Hoover used a top-down approach to resolve economic issues. President Roosevelt took a much more active role with more programs directed at American citizens. The federal government played a larger part in resolving the economic issues of the Great Depression under Roosevelt. Okay. And that's all an inference you can make just by looking at the table and reading above. Far more programs under Roosevelt than there were under Hoover. And those programs targeted more individuals, was a bottom-up approach to fixing the economic issues rather than just fixing banks or corporations, right? All right. So any questions about that? Is everybody able to kind of complete this part of it before we move on?
I'm still writing.
Okay, take your time. Just let me know here. That's the last one anyway. So we'll be finished up after this. But what's most important there too is, you understand how we're making that inference, right? Just making sure that you can see how those things coincide. Go ahead and stop recording.